December 17, 1944, 0530 hours, Honsfeld, Belgium. SS Obersturmführer Joachim Peiper sat in his Tiger tank and felt it shudder to a stop. Not from enemy fire, not from mechanical failure, from empty fuel tanks. This man commanded one of the most lethal armored spearheads in the Wehrmacht. 67 tanks, 149 half-tracks, 5,000 Waffen-SS soldiers, the tip of Germany's last desperate gamble to change the war. And he was paralyzed, sitting in the pre-dawn darkness, because he'd run out of gas 20 miles into the offensive. Then his scouts reported what they'd found in the town the Americans had just abandoned. 50,000 gallons of fuel, sitting in jerry cans, ready to use. Enough to fuel his entire battle group, all the way to the Meuse River, enough to potentially salvage the offensive. Peiper walked through the depot personally, reading the shipping manifests, examining the fuel quality, doing the calculations, and in that moment, standing among mountains of American gasoline, he understood with absolute clarity that Germany had already lost the war. Not because of this battle, because of what this fuel represented. The Americans had so much they could abandon 50,000 gallons without even thinking about it. The Germans were planning entire offensives around capturing exactly this kind of windfall. The strategic implications were crushing. This wasn't a war anymore. This was industrial annihilation. The numbers told a story that German propaganda couldn't spin away. In April 1944, Germany's synthetic fuel plants produced 175,000 tons of fuel monthly. By September, Allied bombing had reduced that to 5,000 tons. December production was even worse. Hydrogenation plants operated at less than 10% capacity. The entire German war machine was running on fumes, literally. Meanwhile, the United States produced 1.8 billion barrels of crude oil in 1944. Germany, including all synthetic production and Romanian oil fields, managed 33 million barrels. That's less than 2% of American output. Not a small disadvantage. A civilization-ending gap. The Ardennes offensive, Operation Watch on the Rhine, required 4.5 million gallons of fuel to execute as planned. Hitler allocated 5 million gallons, confident this was adequate. Only half of it reached the frontline units. The rest was consumed in transport, lost to Allied air attacks, or simply unavailable due to production shortfalls. The German plan explicitly counted on capturing American fuel depots to sustain the advance. Read that again. The offensive plan required stealing enemy fuel to succeed. That's not strategy. That's desperation masquerading as operational planning. Peiper received his briefing on December 15, one day before the offensive began. 29 years old, hardened by years on the Eastern Front, decorated for valor, chosen to command the Schwerpunkt, the decisive point of the entire operation. His mission was to punch through American lines, race 65 miles to the Meuse River, and seize the bridges before Allied reinforcements arrived. His fuel allocation was 31,000 gallons. His staff calculated this provided range for approximately 50 miles of combat operations. The target was 65 miles away. Peiper asked about additional fuel supplies. He was told to capture American depots. That was the plan. Capture enemy fuel or fail. He issued orders that revealed the desperation. Tanks would move in single file to minimize fuel consumption. Engines would be shut off if vehicles halted longer than 5 minutes. Capturing American fuel dumps was the highest tactical priority, above destroying enemy formations, above seizing terrain, above everything. Meanwhile, American units just a few miles away received fuel deliveries multiple times weekly. Their storage tanks were full, their vehicles topped off. Their commanders didn't think about fuel because fuel was always available. The contrast wasn't lost on German intelligence officers who'd been monitoring American logistics. They knew what was coming. Their commanders chose to ignore them. The offensive began with a massive artillery barrage that consumed more ammunition in 2 hours than German units typically received for entire monthly operations. The psychological impact was significant. The material impact was a preview of the fuel disaster to come. Peiper's armored column moved out and immediately encountered problems. Narrow country roads, traffic jams, vehicles bogged down in mud. At Lanzerath, 18 American reconnaissance soldiers held up the advance for 10 hours. 18 men. Peiper's tanks sat idling, burning fuel, waiting for infantry to clear the roadblock. By the time they reached Honsfeld on the morning of December 17th, having covered only 20 miles, they'd consumed 40% of their fuel allocation. They should have been halfway to their objective. They'd barely started, and already the mathematics of defeat were becoming clear. Then they found the depot. 50,000 gallons in American jerry cans. High-octane aviation gasoline mixed with 80-plus octane motor fuel. German vehicles were designed for 74 octane. Some engines actually malfunctioned using the higher-grade American fuel because the Germans had never imagined such quality would be available. But what shocked Peiper more than the quantity was the paperwork. The shipping manifests showed this fuel had traveled from Texas refineries to Normandy beaches in under 6 weeks. Texas to Normandy, across the Atlantic Ocean, under constant U-boat threat, through a supply chain spanning thousands of miles, delivered to a temporary forward depot that wasn't even considered strategically important. The Americans classified it as Class 3B, a minor, expendable supply point. Yet it contained more fuel than an entire German panzer division received monthly. Peiper found recent American newspapers among the supplies. He read articles about a new fuel pipeline delivering 300,000 gallons daily to frontline units. 300,000 gallons per day. That was more than his entire offensive had been allocated total. The newspaper treated this as routine logistics, not a remarkable achievement, just standard American supply operations. The Americans had buried a pipeline under the English Channel. Pluto, they called it. Pipeline under the ocean. It pumped 1 million gallons daily from England to France. Peiper's men found maps showing multiple American fuel depots, each larger than what they'd captured. The U.S. First Army held 3.5 million gallons in strategic reserve, just sitting there, available if needed. The Germans were fighting for every drop. The Americans had reserves measured in millions of gallons. The broader context made it worse. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe had grounded most aircraft due to fuel shortages. Pilot training had been slashed to dangerously low levels because they couldn't spare fuel for instruction flights. U-boats operated on battery power longer to conserve diesel. German civilians hadn't had private automobile access since 1942. All fuel was reserved for military use, and still there wasn't enough. The United States produced 67% of the world's entire oil output. American refineries operated at full capacity and were actually experimenting with byproducts because they had excess crude they didn't know what to do with. While German chemists desperately tried to squeeze fuel from coal using increasingly inefficient synthetic processes, American refiners were inventing new products from petroleum surplus. The scale difference wasn't quantitative, it was qualitative. Different universes of industrial capacity. Peiper's forces captured additional supplies as they pushed deeper into American lines. Each depot revealed the same pattern. Abundant fuel, recent delivery dates, casual abundance. At Ligneuville, they committed what would become known as the Malmedy Massacre, killing 84 American prisoners. Peiper later cited fuel shortages as justification. They couldn't spare vehicles to transport prisoners. The fuel crisis was now driving war crimes. By evening of December 17th, Peiper's spearhead reached Stavelot, site of a major American fuel depot containing over 2 million gallons. Victory seemed possible. Capture this depot and the offensive might actually succeed. Except American engineers, led by Captain John Brewster, had other ideas. They set fire to the entire facility. 2 million gallons went up in flames. The fire burned for 3 days, visible for miles, a beacon of American industrial excess. Fuel that could have sustained Peiper's entire division, perhaps changed the outcome of the battle, destroyed to deny it to the enemy. Similar destruction occurred across the American rear areas. 1.1 million gallons at Topon, 2.5 million gallons at Spa. During the first week of the offensive, American forces deliberately destroyed over 8 million gallons of fuel. 8 million gallons, more than the Germans had allocated for the entire offensive. The Americans could afford to burn their own supplies rather than let them be captured. That level of abundance wasn't just military superiority, it was a different form of warfare entirely. Industrial warfare where waste itself became a weapon. The Germans conserved, the Americans destroyed surplus, and the side that could afford to destroy millions of gallons of fuel was going to win. The Red Ball Express, the American truck convoy system, consumed more fuel just operating than the entire German offensive had been allocated. 6,000 trucks running 24 hours daily, moving supplies from ports to front lines. The trucks themselves burned fuel at rates that would bankrupt German logistics. American daily fuel consumption exceeded 7.5 million gallons. Daily receipts averaged 8.2 million gallons. They were building reserves even during active combat operations. The pipeline network was staggering. Cherbourg to Paris, 800,000 gallons daily capacity. The Seine line, 650,000 gallons daily. These were just supplementary systems backing up the primary supply routes. American vehicles were standardized, efficient, relatively simple to maintain. German forces used a chaotic mix of vehicles from different manufacturers with incompatible parts. American supply officers could order replacement engines knowing they'd fit any truck in the fleet. German mechanics needed to identify specific vehicle models before ordering parts that might not be available. The logistical philosophy differed fundamentally. Americans built systems assuming abundance. Germans built systems assuming scarcity. In modern mechanized warfare, the side assuming abundance correctly was going to dominate. Tiger tanks consumed 2.5 gallons per mile. Panther tanks burned 1.5 gallons per mile. For comparison, American Sherman tanks used 0.8 gallons per mile. The fuel efficiency gap meant German forces needed vastly more fuel to accomplish the same operational objectives, and they had vastly less available. The Ardennes terrain, with steep hills and thick forests, increased fuel consumption by an estimated 40%. By December 18, Peiper's forces had consumed 67,000 gallons of fuel. They'd captured 55,000 gallons from various American depots. They were operating at a fuel deficit from day 2 of the offensive. Ultra intercepts, the Allied code-breaking system, allowed American commanders to monitor German fuel shortages in real time. They issued explicit orders to destroy all fuel stocks rather than allow capture. The Americans could afford this strategy. They had more coming. The Germans were flying blind, hoping to stumble across depots while their tanks sputtered toward empty. Meanwhile, the Americans supplied besieged Bastogne with 160,000 gallons of fuel delivered by air. By air, they were flying fuel in transport aircraft to a surrounded garrison while German forces a few miles away were abandoning vehicles for lack of gas. The realization spread through German ranks like a virus. Peiper's commanders acknowledged privately that fuel shortages would prevent reaching objectives. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, recognized the offensive was doomed within 72 hours of launch. Not because of American tactical skill or defensive positions, because of fuel. Captured German soldiers expressed shock at American waste. They'd watched American troops use gasoline to start campfires. Seen fuel discarded because cans were slightly dented. Observed vehicles left idling for hours because shutting them off and restarting consumed less fuel than the Americans used for morning coffee. These weren't propaganda stories. These were direct observations that shattered any remaining belief in German victory. The industrial disparity was so vast that American carelessness exceeded German efficiency. Peiper himself reflected in later years that December 17th, standing in that captured fuel depot, was the moment he knew Germany was finished. Not would be finished. Was finished. The war was already over. They just hadn't stopped fighting yet. American industrial warfare reached its peak during the German offensive. Patton's Third Army redeployed from the south, a maneuver requiring 350,000 gallons of fuel consumed in just 3 days. The operation was considered one of the great logistical achievements of the war. The Germans saw it as confirmation of limitless American resources. Allied air sorties during Christmas week burned more fuel in a single day than the entire German offensive had been allocated. Fighter bombers, transport aircraft, reconnaissance planes, all consuming aviation gasoline at rates that would have sustained German armies for weeks. By December 23rd and 24th, Peiper's situation was hopeless. He abandoned his vehicles and escaped on foot with whatever men could still march. The remaining tanks were destroyed not by enemy action, but by lack of fuel. Of 119 tanks and assault guns that began the offensive, only 39 remained mechanically operational. All 39 were immobilized, empty tanks, useless metal. The entire German armored spearhead reduced to stationary targets because they couldn't find gas stations. Field Marshal Walter Model, overall commander of the offensive, was reportedly shocked when he saw captured documents detailing American fuel stocks. He stated to his staff, "We are not fighting the same war. They fight with industry. We fight with courage. Industry wins." Adolf Hitler refused to accept these reports. He dismissed evidence of American fuel abundance as propaganda or Hollywood special effects designed to demoralize German troops. He genuinely believed American abundance was exaggerated, that their logistics were as strained as German logistics, that one more push would crack their resolve. Lower-ranking German officers who'd seen the evidence knew better, but Hitler was still Führer, and his denial of reality continued to drive strategy until the final collapse. The statistics comparing Axis and Allied production tell the complete story. United States petroleum production in 1944, 1.8 billion barrels. Germany plus all Axis allies combined, 33 million barrels, less than 2% of American output. Aircraft production. Americans built 324,750 aircraft. Germans and Axis allies built 119,970. Tank production. Americans 88,410. Germans 46,857. Every category showed similar ratios. But petroleum was the most extreme. Approximately 50-to-1 production advantage. The psychological impact on German troops was devastating. Soldiers who'd been fed propaganda about American weakness and decadence saw endless convoys of supplies, watched Americans casually discard equipment Germans would fight over, experienced the futility of tactical excellence against material abundance. Stories spread through German ranks about Americans using artillery for Christmas celebrations, firing expensive shells just to make noise and boost morale. About Americans throwing away rations because they were a day old. About fuel used to heat tents in rear areas while German soldiers froze on the front lines without heat because fuel was combat allocated only. Every story undermined the myth of German superiority and revolutionary National Socialist efficiency. The promised thousand-year Reich couldn't keep its tanks running for 3 days. During the Nuremberg trials, German military leaders repeatedly cited fuel shortages as decisive factors in defeat, not as excuses, as factual assessments of why German tactical and operational skill couldn't overcome Allied industrial superiority. They'd fought brilliant campaigns with inadequate resources and lost to mediocre campaigns with overwhelming resources. The lesson was clear. In modern warfare, logistics determines outcomes more than courage, tactics, or innovation. Peiper's testimony years later was remarkably candid. He admitted that every decision after December 17th was dictated by fuel shortages. Where to attack, which routes to take, which objectives to prioritize, when to retreat, all determined by fuel availability rather than tactical considerations. He'd commanded one of the war's most elite units with some of Germany's best equipment and most experienced soldiers. None of it mattered because they couldn't fuel their vehicles. General Heinz Guderian, father of German armored doctrine, reflected that when Peiper captured 50,000 gallons and it still wasn't enough while Americans could burn millions, the war's outcome was never in doubt. The Battle of the Bulge consumed approximately 2.8 million gallons of German fuel over 6 weeks. American forces consumed approximately 267 million gallons during the same period. The ratio was roughly 95-to-1. Dr. Richard Overy, the preeminent historian of industrial warfare, calculated that Allied to Axis production ratios exceeded 5-to-1 in most major categories and approached 50-to-1 in petroleum specifically. This wasn't a war. This was industrial massacre. Despite capturing 50,000 gallons of American fuel at Honsfeld, Peiper's forces were overwhelmed by an enemy that burned millions without concern. The fuel quality itself revealed technological gaps. American fuel contained additives preventing freezing in extreme cold, detergents keeping engines clean, octane boosters providing higher performance. German fuel was basic petroleum, or synthetic fuel with minimal refinement. American mechanics could swap engines in 45 minutes using standardized parts and power tools. German mechanics needed hours for similar repairs using hand tools and improvised solutions. Even when Germans captured American fuel, their vehicles sometimes couldn't use it properly because the quality exceeded their engine specifications. The irony was brutal. Germany lost partially because their technology couldn't handle superior captured resources. Medical evacuation demonstrated the disparity. American wounded were transported via ambulance and aircraft, consuming fuel generously to save lives. German wounded walked if they could, rode in horse-drawn carts if they couldn't, or were simply left behind when units retreated due to fuel shortages. The German army's mobility collapsed entirely by February 1945 when synthetic fuel production ceased. Units became stationary, unable to redeploy, unable to retreat, surrendering without battle because they couldn't move. The Ardennes offensive's failure cemented German defeat, not because it lost territory or destroyed divisions. Both were recoverable, because it proved beyond doubt that Germany lacked the industrial capacity to sustain modern mechanized warfare. Every remaining German soldier understood this at some level. The propaganda collapsed under the weight of observable reality. You can't lie about empty fuel tanks. You can't spin your way out of immobilized armies. The physical evidence was inescapable. Peiper's abandoned Tiger tank still sits in L'Église, Belgium, a monument to the moment when tactical excellence surrendered to logistical reality. Tourists photograph it, unaware it represents something more profound than military hardware. It represents the death of an ideology that claimed willpower and racial superiority could overcome material disadvantages. It represents the victory of industrial democracy over militaristic fascism. It represents the simple truth that in modern warfare, victory belongs to the side with more fuel, more steel, more industrial capacity. Courage and skill matter, but they matter less than gasoline. The war ended when German armies stopped moving, not because they were defeated in battle, but because they ran out of fuel to reach battlefields. Entire units surrendered with full ammunition stocks because they couldn't transport it. Tank crews abandoned operational vehicles because there was no fuel to run them. The last German offensives were planned and cancelled repeatedly due to fuel shortages until planning became meaningless. By April 1945, German commanders were issuing orders knowing they couldn't be executed because units lacked fuel to comply. The command structure maintained the pretense of functionality, while the actual military force dissolved from immobility. The Americans, meanwhile, were running out of storage space for fuel reserves. Their problem was too much supply, not too little. They were experimenting with using fuel for non-military purposes, just to reduce inventory. The gulf between German scarcity and American abundance remained infinite until the final surrender. Decades later, veterans from both sides gathered and discussed the fuel disparity. German veterans described the hopelessness of watching American convoys roll past with more fuel in support vehicles than German armies had for combat operations. American veterans admitted they'd taken fuel availability for granted, never imagining it was a significant advantage because from their perspective, fuel was just always there. Like air or water. The German war diaries confirm it. Hundreds of entries detailing fuel shortages, failed operations due to lack of fuel, vehicles abandoned, tactical opportunities missed because tanks couldn't reach positions. The American diaries barely mention fuel except in logistics reports showing consistent surplus. The psychological difference was fundamental. German commanders planned around fuel constraints. American commanders planned assuming unlimited fuel and were consistently correct. When your fundamental assumption about resource availability is opposite your enemy's reality, you're fighting different wars. And the side fighting with abundance beats the side fighting with scarcity every single time. The final accounting shows that Peiper's discovery at Honsfeld was simultaneously a windfall and a revelation of doom. 50,000 gallons was enough to sustain his unit temporarily, but the context, that this was a minor depot the Americans could abandon, that they had millions more available, that they could afford to destroy their own fuel rather than defend it, revealed the strategic impossibility of German victory. The mathematics were irrefutable. The Germans were fighting a war measured in thousands of gallons. The Americans were fighting a war measured in millions. When one side can destroy more resources than the other side can capture, the outcome is predetermined. Peiper understood this standing in that Belgian fuel depot on December 17, 1944. He just captured one of the most significant fuel supplies of the entire German offensive, and he knew it didn't matter, because the Americans would just bring more. They always had more. That was the secret weapon. Not better tanks or braver soldiers or superior tactics. Just more. More fuel, more steel, more everything. Industrial warfare at its essence. The side with more wins. The Germans fought brilliantly with scarce resources and lost to mediocre execution with overwhelming resources. The abandoned Tiger tank at L'Église proves it. All the engineering excellence, tactical skill, and warrior courage in the world couldn't matter when the fuel gauge read empty. Victory belongs to the side that can afford to waste what the enemy desperately needs. The Americans wasted fuel. The Germans needed every drop. That's why the Americans won. That's why Peiper's 50,000 gallons meant nothing. Because while he was celebrating capturing enough fuel for maybe 3 more days of combat, the Americans were burning millions and planning to burn millions more. The war was decided in Texas oil fields and Pennsylvania refineries long before it was decided on Belgian battlefields. Peiper just happened to be the one who saw the proof firsthand and understood what it meant. Germany was doomed, not by military defeat, by industrial reality. The Tiger tank stopped because it ran out of gas, and there was no gas station. There would never be a gas station. That's how empires fall, not with dramatic last stands, with empty fuel tanks.